something on the order of a mile for one person. You need the resources. Now, for dry farming, you can support somewhere between 1 and 2 people per square mile. So you need, you can support twice as many people at the very least with dry farming. So when farming starts, there is a substantial human population increase. When farming starts, when we start to raise turkeys, but what we really start is with sheep and goats, and then with cattle, you can double the population in any area. You can double the population. That never happened among humans before. Okay, this isn't like a new frontier where you go south. The population doubles in place. Irrigated farming six people plus. Irrigated farming is enormously productive. So, I give you the overall of these figures. By 10,000 years ago, the Earth is filled, the habitable parts, very thinly. Not uniformly, but thinly. At 10,000, people in a number of different areas start to farm based on rainfall farming. Farming is invented in the northern part of what we call the Hilly Crescent. It's currently where the Kurds live in northern Iraq. We call these the hilly flanks of the Zagros Mountains and the hilly uplands. It rains. There is plenty of food used by hunters and gatherers there. And people domesticate wheat, barley, emmer, and they domesticate sheep and goats. But simultaneously in Mexico, in southern Mexico, people are domesticating corn, beans, and squash, and maybe some birds. But simultaneously in southern China and Thailand or Southeast Asia, people have begun to domesticate rice, peppers, avocados, and a bunch of things. Quite different foods. Okay, so as soon as that happens, and you want to see it as a mosaic, it's independent, but as a mosaic brought about by population pressure. Nowhere to go. You want to see it brought about by intense, conservative, local familiarity with the plants and the animals. That's the easy one to get. There is no experimentation going on here in terms of trying the foods which you hate. Many people can't stand eating this time of year, eating the waterfowl, the wildfowl from Chesapeake Bay, because of course they taste fishy, because what do you suppose they eat? So there's no using foods you never ate before. That's not what's going on. But what is going on around the world, and I personally, from what I know, this has to have happened somewhere in Peru as well. I mean, nobody invented domesticated potatoes where potatoes don't grow. And that's true of a whole lot of other things, grow naturally. So here, in those locations, the population doubles, triples, the population goes way up. And people begin to live in villages. This is probably the single most interesting thing to you, although it is domesticated food from our point of view as an economy. People live in one place, and a village can support a very much larger population, 5,000 people. It's the size of some of the first villages. And they are supported through intensive dry farming. Everybody wants to know when this stuff starts. This is when this stuff starts. And then irrigated farming comes a couple thousand years later. But irrigated farming is a predictable supply of water, managed in a much more predictable way, and it increases by 6 times the population. So the reason cities get founded in southern Iraq is not because things grow there naturally. They do not, as we saw. What goes on is you can irrigate the desert, which is itself, as most people know, very, very fertile. And when you put water on it systematically, it produces so much food, the population increases gigantically. And it's on that basis that civilization as we know it, or as we define it, not as we know it, is actually founded. So we say that this is a major change in human events. Population shoots way up in certain places. However, ownership of the land changes. By the time you get to here, and by the time you get to here, one has the beginning of social stratification. Haves and have-nots, people who own the land, people who control the land, people who control the harvest, people who have to pay for the harvest. This is when virtually all anthropologists and archaeologists think is the founding of a society that is stratified like our own. I mean, one of the things you can see, if you, and I know you do, you either listen to the news or you watch it visually somehow or the other, or you read the newspaper. This is an election that'll take place in about a month, a little less, about social stratification. Who owns the wealth? Now let's suppose I don't have an opinion, and let's suppose all of you do. So how did society get stratified so that you do not have what your neighbor has? You have less or you have more. And how did it get legitimized? Well, this is when. So because only 10% of the land can be farmed and only 1% is subject to irrigation, then what happens is that people control water rights. People control rights to the surplus. This is actually when title to land happens. And it happens between village farming 10,000 years ago and irrigated farming, which happens about 5,000 years ago. And because there is so little land, and that's the key variable, there is so little land, and kinship is replaced by other forms of social organization, loyalty to a leader, petty king. By petty, we mean small time, not a lot of territory. What happens is the society becomes much more stratified. It becomes stratified for the first time. Hunters and gatherers are notoriously unstratified. Yes, of course, there'd be the paterfamilias, the guy who is in charge, occasionally the woman who's in charge, but we actually never found much of that ethnographically. But nonetheless, when the guy gets old, yeah, he gets bumped off. When his son comes along, you know, he's in charge among hunters and gatherers. And because there's so much fissioning, the family is the key unit. Okay, so the beginning of social stratification, the beginning of scarce resources, and we call this a change in the mode of production. A sort of leftist term, but I don't mean it in that way. What we have here is a change in how food is produced, and a change in who does the producing. And it is the beginning of social stratification. The final point I want to say here goes back to something you will remember, but I want to kind of coax you here. You remember when we first invaded Iraq 6, 7, 8 years ago? We landed in southern Iraq, actually quite close to Babylon, and a little further north of Ur. And you saw the dust storms, and you saw the desert, and so forth. Well, that is not how this place looked 10,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago. It was actually pretty green. So southern Iraq has been made into a desert by overfarming. Last weekend, not yesterday and the day before, but the weekend 10 days ago now. I was in Los Angeles. I went out right after my lecture on a Wednesday and flew out to San Diego to give a lecture at San Diego State. I'd never been to San Diego before, so, and then I had friends, I was staying with friends in Riverside, and I also drove. I'm very proud of this. I rented a car and I drove the freeways. So I went from San Diego to Riverside, Riverside to Los Angeles to see the Getty Museum on the hilltop, and then back to San Diego. I tell you, I have never driven on a road that was 7 lanes wide. You truly don't know where you are. And man, by the time you're finished, you're tired. You can't miss anything. So, for those of you who know Southern California, it is called a desert. For those of you who don't know Southern California, it's a wrecked landscape. This is not how it looked. The reason that there are mudslides is not because it rains, this is because the foliage is gone. And there's nothing to hold this unconsolidated earth in place. And I really did not understand until I saw it, although this was not my first visit, that people just chisel something into the hillside and plunk a house there and expect to have a night's sleep time after time after time. Well, these are wrecked environments because there are too many people using too much water, farming too much, and not putting things back. I asked my friend, who's an archaeologist, he digs in Peru, how is Southern California going to get its water? And he swore, I think it's probably the only word I cannot use here without getting a reprimand from a dean. He said that there isn't any more. So I thought to myself, that's really good. How are you going to solve this problem? Well, in southern Iraq, we see that they did not. They did 2 things in southern Iraq. They put too much water on the land. And because the water table is high, which it is, in some places, if you put too much water on the fields, it evaporates. Water has salts in it, minerals, and if they are deposited through evaporation, then the salts decrease the fertility of the land, and you cannot grow wheat. What you see is over irrigation and the decreased fertility of land in southern Iraq. And it happened through bad farming. What's going on in Southern California, and I mention this just because I happened to be there, and I loved driving around and seeing this place, is that they have put too many people in too unconservative a way on the land and discover that they can still have lawns. They can still not have spray showers. They can still, they're not safe. And what will actually happen is what you can see happening now in Tucson. The place is going to dry up. It's going to dry up faster in Phoenix. So I don't actually know that these things are going to happen in the southwestern United States, but I do know that you can see much of the Near East in terms of what farming actually did. All right, that's the final point I want to make about farming, and that is it begins the only process of environmental destruction that we are responsible for, or at least it is the first illustration of environmental destruction. I'll give you a nice example of this. How many of you have been to England? How many of you have been to Italy? Okay. Those are magnificent Neolithic landscapes. There are no forests. They were taken out in Neolithic times. The sculpted nature of English landscapes, you know, those wonderful fields, the hedgerows, there aren't any forests, virtually none. Tuscany, southern Italy, those are all farming landscapes. We think they're beautiful, they're in Renaissance, this is and that. We walk through them and so on and so forth. That's also the product of farming. So I have just a minute or two left, and I want to make sure you get in your notebook this model. So when we meet again on Wednesday, I'll walk you through the model because